The fluorescent lights of the Pick and Save manager's office hummed with a low, agonizing vibration that always gave Mike a headache right around 11 p.m. But tonight, the buzz in his skull wasn't from the lighting. It was from the rhythmic, aggressive thud, thud, thud of a sneaker heel slamming against the side of his steel desk. You can kick that desk until the paint peels, Tony. It doesn't change the paperwork, and it sure as hell doesn't change where you're sleeping tonight. Tony didn't look up. At 16, he had already mastered the art of weaponized silence. He kept his eyes locked on his worn-out skate shoes, his oversized black hoodie pulled up like a shield against the world. His jaw was set, a visual carbon copy of his mother's stubbornness. "I don't need a babysitter," Tony muttered, his voice cracking slightly before settling into a defensive growl. "And I definitely don't need a grocery clerk telling me what to do." "I'm a store manager," Mike corrected, his voice flat, exhausted. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling every single one of his 38 years. "And right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and a state-run group home. Your mom is facing federal fraud charges, Tony. She's locked down in a county facility, and until the judge says otherwise, you are my responsibility." "She didn't do it," Tony snapped, his head whipping up, eyes flashing with a dangerous, protective fire. "The feds think otherwise," Mike said quietly. He leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the desk. "Look, I know you're angry, but we have to make this work. For the neighborhood. For your future." Just then, the office door clicked open. Susan stood in the doorway, her arms tightly crossed over her tailored trench coat. She didn't step inside the room. She stood on the threshold, a clear physical boundary. She looked at Mike, then glanced at Tony, her expression a mix of pity and absolute resolve. "Mike," Susan said, her voice a cool, calm contrast to the heat in the room. "The Uber's downstairs. We need to talk. Now." Mike sighed, standing up. "Tony, stay here. Don't touch anything." Before we find out what Susan tells Mike in that hallway, and before the dark secrets hidden in this grocery store unravel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this family dynamic turns into a fight for survival. Build up. In the narrow, concrete hallway behind the employee break room, the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Susan looked at Mike, her eyes softening, but her posture remaining rigid. She was a woman who built her life on predictability and high-end corporate logistics. A sudden, traumatized teenager did not fit into her 5-year plan. "I love you, Mike," Susan began, her voice low so it wouldn't carry back to the office. "But we talked about this when we moved into the apartment on Brady Street. We chose a life without children, our careers, our freedom. I am not built to play stepmom to a kid who looks like he wants to set the world on fire." "He's my nephew, Susan," Mike pleaded, reaching for her hand. "What am I supposed to do? Let the state take him? It's temporary. Just until the trial." "There's nothing temporary about a kid like that," she replied gently, pulling her hand away. "I'm going to stay at a hotel downtown for a few days. You need to figure out what your priority is. Because I can't live like this." She turned and walked down the back stairs, leaving Mike alone in the quiet corridor. The next morning, the reality of Mike's new life hit with the force of a Milwaukee blizzard. He brought Tony to his small apartment, only to be greeted on the front steps by Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed captain of the neighborhood watch. She was a woman who lived behind her curtains, armed with a clipboard and a deep suspicion of anyone under the age of 25. "Morning, Michael," Mrs. Gable called out, sweeping non-existent snow off her porch. Her eyes traveled slowly down Tony's baggy clothes and the defensive scowl etched onto his face. "I see we have a new addition. I hope he knows the noise ordinances around here. The last thing this block needs is trouble." "He's my nephew, Mrs. Gable. He's staying with me," Mike said curtly, pushing Tony ahead of him into the building. By afternoon, Mike had to be back at Pick and Save. Unable to leave Tony alone without expecting a call from the police, he forced the boy to sit in the store's break room. It was an awkward arrangement. Mike spent his hours managing shifting inventory, dealing with angry customers, and watching his nephew through the security cameras. It was during the late-night closing routine that everything changed. Mike was double-checking the locks on the rear loading dock when he noticed Tony's seat in the break room was empty. A cold sweat broke out on Mike's neck. He rushed through the dark aisles of the store, his boots echoing against the polished linoleum. He checked the bathrooms, the bakery, the frozen food section. Nothing. Panicked, he pushed open the heavy back exit door that led to the dark, snow-dusted alleyway behind the supermarket. The biting Milwaukee wind hit his face, but he froze when he heard voices muffled by the brick walls. Mike crept along the shadows of the dumpster, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the dim orange glow of the alley's security light, he saw Tony. The boy was standing next to a sleek, dark sedan. Confronting him was Derek, a charismatic but notoriously dangerous 20-year-old who controlled most of the illicit street trade in the Lower East Side. Tony was holding a thick, heavy canvas duffel bag. He handed it over to Derek, his hands shaking slightly in the cold. Mike's blood ran cold. His nephew wasn't just a rebellious kid coping with his mother's arrest. He was actively running errands for the city's criminal underbelly. Mike stepped out from the shadows, ready to yell, but stopped when he saw Derek clap Tony on the shoulder, leaning in to whisper something that made Tony nod with absolute, terrified obedience. Mike realized with a sickening jolt that he was completely out of his depth. He backed away into the store, closing the door silently, totally unaware that the true danger hadn't even begun, and that a single, innocent mistake made inside his store earlier that day would soon put a target directly on their backs. The confrontation inside the apartment that night was explosive. Mike stood by the kitchen counter, the heavy canvas duffel bag sitting between them like an unexploded bomb. He had intercepted Tony at the back door before the boy could slip away. "Explain this, now," Mike demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. Tony stared at the bag, his face pale, but his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. "It's not mine. I'm just holding it for a guy. To protect Mom." "Protect her how, Tony? By getting yourself thrown into a juvenile detention center? Who is Derek?" Tony flinched at the name. "You don't know him, Mike, and you don't want to. If that bag isn't kept safe, they're going to make sure Mom never sees the outside of a courtroom. Just leave it alone." Desperate to keep Tony out of the hands of both the police and the streets, Mike made a choice he knew he might regret. He took the bag back to Pick and Save the following morning. He couldn't keep it in the apartment with Mrs. Gable watching their every move like a hawk. Instead, he shoved it into the bottom drawer of his file cabinet inside the locked manager's office. He locked the cabinet, locked the office door, and slid the master key ring into his front pocket. By midday, the stress was bleeding into every corner of Mike's life. To make matters worse, his phone rang with a call from Aunt Brenda, the matriarch of the family who always managed to offer a mountain of criticism without a single grain of actual help. Within an hour, Brenda arrived at the store, her heavy perfume filling the small manager's office. She paced back and forth, her gold jewelry clinking loudly. "I just don't understand how your sister could be so reckless," Brenda sighed dramatically, adjusting her fur coat. "And now you're bringing that boy into your home? Mike, look at you. You can barely manage this grocery store, let alone a delinquent. You're going to ruin your life. And for what? Loyalty?" "He's family, Brenda," Mike said, his voice tight. "Family is a two-way street," Brenda snapped. "He's going to drag you down. Mark my words." As if on cue, Susan walked into the store. She had come to collect the rest of her things from Mike's apartment keyring, but seeing Brenda there only amplified the tension. "Oh, Susan, thank goodness you have some sense," Brenda said, turning her sharp gaze to her. "Tell him he's being a fool." Susan looked at Mike, her eyes filled with a painful conflict. "I already told him, Brenda, but Mike has to make his own choices. I'm just here to say goodbye for now, Mike. I can't be part of this circus." The argument spilled out of the office and into the employee break room. Mike was so overwhelmed, trying to defend his choices to both his aunt and his departing girlfriend, that he pulled his key ring out to hand Susan her apartment key. In his distraction, he set the heavy master key ring down on the cluttered break room table. 10 minutes later, Susan left, Brenda stormed out, and Mike was called to the front lanes to handle a massive register malfunction. The keys remained on the table, forgotten. Enter Martha. Martha was a 72-year-old cashier who had worked at that Pick and Save for nearly 3 decades. She was kind, deeply traditional, and terribly forgetful, but she possessed an intense desire to keep the store orderly. While wiping down the break room tables during her afternoon break, she spotted the heavy brass keyring. "Oh dear," Martha murmured to herself, shaking her head. "Someone's going to lose their head over these." Thinking she was doing a good deed and wanting to ensure no unauthorized employee took them, Martha picked up the keys. Instead of walking them to the office, which was currently locked, she walked over to the customer service desk and dropped them deep into the bottom of the lost and found bin, completely out of sight beneath a pile of forgotten umbrellas and winter gloves. She meant to tell Mike later, But an immediate rush of holiday shoppers wiped the thought clean from her mind. By 8 p.m., the store was quiet. The winter storm outside had driven most customers home early. Mike was in the aisle counting inventory when the front sliding doors chimed. He looked up, expecting a late-night shopper. Instead, his heart dropped. Derek walked in, flanked by two large, imposing men in heavy leather jackets. They didn't look like they were here for groceries. They walked with a slow, deliberate confidence straight toward the back of the store where Mike was standing. "Can I help you guys?" Mike asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he stood his ground. Derek smiled, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned against a display of canned soup, tapping his knuckles against the metal shelf. "We're looking for a missing shipment," Derek said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Tony tells me he gave it to you for safekeeping. Smart kid. But the time for safekeeping is over. We need that duffel bag back, manager." "I don't know what you're talking about," Mike lied, his hands clenching into fists inside his pockets. Derek's smile vanished. He leaned in closer, the scent of cheap cologne and cold rain radiating off him. "Let's skip the games. We know it's here. If that bag isn't sitting in the back alley by exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow night, we're going to collect the debt in a different way. And trust me, Mike, you don't want to find out what your nephew's life is actually worth to us." Derek patted Mike's shoulder, a terrifying echo of the gesture he had given Tony in the alley. Before turning and walking out of the store with his men, Mike stood frozen in the aisle, the silence of the empty supermarket suddenly feeling like a suffocating weight. He reached into his pocket to grab his keys, to go get the bag and hand it over immediately, only to find his pocket completely empty. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Mike's veins. He slapped his pockets, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The keys were gone. He ran back to the break room, tearing through the cushions of the sofa, throwing aside old newspapers and empty coffee cups. Nothing. He checked the manager's office door, twisting the brass handle uselessly. It remained firmly locked, sealing the heavy canvas duffel bag inside. "Tony!" Mike shouted, storming back into the main store area where his nephew was sweeping the bakery aisle. Mike grabbed the broom out of the boy's hands, his temper flaring past the point of control. "Where are they? Did you take them?" Tony stumbled back, startled and defensive. "Take what? What are you talking about?" "The keys, Tony! The master keys! Derek was just here. He threatened both of us. I went to get the bag to give it back to him, and my keys are gone. Did you give them to him? Are you helping them rob my store?" "I didn't take your stupid keys," Tony yelled back, his face flushing red with hurt and anger. "You think I'm just a thief? You're just like everyone else." "You look at me and see my mom. You never believed me." "Tony, lives are on the line here," Mike roared. "Yeah, and you clearly care more about your store than me." Tony slammed his hands against a bakery display, tears of frustration welling in his eyes. Before Mike could stop him, Tony bolted toward the emergency exit at the side of the store. He pushed the bar down, the alarm wailing in a high-pitched scream as he vanished into the blinding Milwaukee blizzard. "Tony, wait!" Mike cried out, running to the door, but the freezing wind and driving snow swallowed the boy instantly. Mike stood in the doorway, the alarm blaring over his head, feeling completely defeated. He had to shut the alarm off, but without his keys, he had to use the master breaker in the electrical room. By the time he silenced the siren, 20 minutes had passed. He drove home in a frenzy, hoping Tony had gone back to the apartment. But as he pulled up to the curb on Brady Street, his headlights illuminated a squad car parked directly in front of his building. Mrs. Gable was standing on her porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Mike's apartment windows as she spoke to a police officer. Mike got out of the car, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. "Mrs. Gable? What's going on?" "I'll tell you what's going on, Michael," she said, her voice dripping with self-righteous satisfaction. "I saw that boy of yours sprinting down the street, throwing bricks into the alleyway, acting completely manic. He looked like he was on something. I told you we didn't need that kind of element on this block. I called the authorities to protect this neighborhood." "He's a kid, Mrs. Gable! He's upset!" Mike snapped, turning to the officer. "Officer, my nephew is missing in a snowstorm. We need to find him." Before the officer could respond, a sleek silver sedan pulled up behind the police cruiser. Susan stepped out. She hadn't been able to stay away. Her conscience had gotten the better of her. She walked up to Mike, her face pale. "Mike, I saw Tony," Susan said, her voice trembling. "He was running back toward the avenue, but there were men following him. Mike, we need to go, now!" The police officer looked between Mike, Susan, and Mrs. Gable, thoroughly confused by the escalating drama. "All right, everyone calm down. Sir, let's get inside and get a description of the boy." But Mike didn't hear him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a restricted number. He answered it, pressing the phone tightly to his ear against the howling wind. "You're running out of time, manager." Derek's voice purred through the line. "The kid thought he could hide out near the tracks. We have him. Bring the bag to the store. Now, or we bring him to you in pieces." The line went dead. Mike looked at Susan, then at the officer. He couldn't tell the police, not with Tony's life hanging in the balance. "I have to go back to the store," Mike whispered, his face white. "Mike, what is happening?" Susan demanded, grabbing his arm. "Just come with me," he begged. As they piled into Mike's car, leaving a shouting Mrs. Gable and a suspicious police officer on the sidewalk, a heavy, suffocating dread settled over them. But as they raced through the snowy streets of Milwaukee, a sudden flash of orange light cut through the midnight sky in the distance. The direction was unmistakable. It was coming from the exact location of the pick and save. The night sky above the pick and save was thick with rolling black smoke. By the time Mike spun his car into the parking lot, the rear loading dock area was engulfed in a low, angry orange glow. The store's automated fire sirens were wailing, their echoes bouncing off the empty concrete parking lot. "Susan, stay in the car! Call the fire department!" Mike shouted, throwing his door open. "Mike! No! It's a trap!" she screamed after him, but he was already sprinting toward the side employee entrance. The door had been jimmied open, the metal frame bent. Inside, the store was a nightmare of flashing strobe lights and thick, acrid smoke that hung from the ceiling like a heavy fog. Mike pulled the collar of his shirt over his mouth and nose, coughing violently as he navigated the dark aisles. He rushed toward the back corridor, his eyes watering from the smoke. As he rounded the corner near the employee break room, he heard the sound of heavy metal grinding against concrete. Through the haze, he saw them. Derek and his two enforcers were using a crowbar, desperately trying to pry open the heavy steel door of the manager's office. Slumped on the floor against the wall, his hands zip-tied behind his back, was Tony. His face was bruised, but his eyes were wide with pure terror. "Hey!" Mike roared, charging down the hallway. Derek whipped around, a heavy metal pipe in his hand. "Well, look who finally showed up. You're late, manager, and my patience just ran out. Open the damn door." "I told you, I lost the keys." Mike choked out, the smoke making it hard to breathe. "The office is sealed." One of the enforcers kicked the office door in frustration. "He's lying. Let's just break the kid's legs and leave them both to burn." Tony looked up at Mike, tears streaming through the soot on his face. "Mike, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Seeing his nephew trapped, Mike felt a sudden, desperate clarity. He remembered the afternoon. He remembered the argument with Susan and Brenda in the break room. He remembered having his keys out, the break room table. Mike turned and bolted into the adjacent break room. It was filling fast with smoke. He checked the table. Nothing. He checked the floor. Then, his eyes caught the gleam of brass near the customer service desk just outside the break room door. The lost and found bin had been knocked over in the chaos. Spilling out from beneath an old winter coat was his master key ring. Martha had put them there. The innocent action of an old woman trying to be helpful had nearly cost them their lives. Mike snatched the keys, ran back into the hallway, and held them up. I got him! I got him! Just don't hurt him!" Derek lowered the pipe, nodding to his men. "Open it! Now!" Mike's hands shook violently as he found the master key, slid it into the lock, and turned it. The heavy steel door clicked open. He rushed inside, pulled open the bottom drawer of the file cabinet, and hauled out the heavy canvas duffel bag. He threw it onto the desk in front of Derek. "Take it and get out!" Mike gasped, lunging down to help Tony to his feet. Derek grinned, slicing Tony's zip ties with a pocket knife. "Pleasure doing business with you, manager." Derek zipped open the bag, eager to feast his eyes on the millions in illicit bearer bonds and cash that Tony's mother had allegedly stolen from their operation. But as the bag fell open under the flickering office light, Derek's grin froze. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. He reached into the bag and pulled out a handful of items. It wasn't cash. It wasn't bonds. It was stacks of worthless, expired pick-and-save grocery store coupons, packed tightly around 3 heavy bags of baking flour to give the bag its weight. "What is this?" Derek roared, slamming his fist onto the desk. He grabbed Mike by the throat, pinning him against the wall. "You think this is a joke? You swapped it. Where is the real take?" "I didn't swap anything," Mike choked out, clawing at Derek's hands. "That's exactly how Tony brought it to me. I swear to God." "He's telling the truth." Tony screamed, trying to pull the enforcers off his uncle. "I never opened it. My mom gave it to me just like that." The room seemed to shrink as the fire outside the window grew brighter. But before Derek could strike Mike, a calm, cold voice echoed from the smoky doorway of the office. "He didn't swap it, Derek, because the real contents never made it into this store." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, coughing slightly but holding herself with a chilling amount of poise, was Aunt Brenda. Behind her stood two men in dark suits, federal agents, their badges gleaming in the flashing emergency lights. Mike stared in utter disbelief. "Brenda, what are you doing here?" Brenda looked at Mike, a look of profound, icy condescension on her face. "Oh, Michael, you always were too soft for your own good. Did you really think your sister was smart enough to pull off a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme on her own? She was just the delivery girl, for Derek and for me." The puzzle pieces shattered into place in Mike's mind. "You," Mike whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You set her up." "I secured my future," Brenda corrected coldly, adjusting her leather gloves. "Your sister got greedy, and Derek here got sloppy. When she realized the feds were closing in, she panicked and gave the evidence to Tony to hide. But I intercepted the real bag from her apartment before Tony even picked it up. I replaced it with, well, your store's inventory. I used the real evidence to cut a deal with the United States Attorney's Office. Total immunity. In exchange, I delivered Derek, his operation, and the final location of the stolen assets." "You used us!" Tony shouted, his voice breaking. "You let them hunt me! They almost killed me!" "An unfortunate necessity to make the narrative believable," Brenda said smoothly, turning to the federal agents. "Gentlemen, there's your man, Derek and his associates. My nephew and his uncle were merely collateral damage." Derek lunged toward Brenda in a fit of rage, but the federal agents were faster. They tackled him to the floor, zip-tying his hands behind his back as sirens wailed outside, closer now. But as Derek was dragged up, he looked back at Mike and Tony, a malicious glint in his eye. He pointed a finger at Mike. "You think she's saving you?" Derek spat, blood on his lip. "The feds don't care about family, manager. I told them weeks ago that this grocery store was our main distribution hub. I told them you were the one laundering the cash through your registers. Look at the paperwork in that cabinet. Your sister put your name on everything." One of the federal agents stepped forward, looking at Mike with a grim expression. "Michael Vance, you and the boy need to step outside. You're under arrest for conspiracy and federal fraud." Mike looked at the cuffs in the agent's hand, the smoke stinging his eyes, realization washing over him that his aunt's betrayal hadn't just saved her. It had perfectly framed him to take the fall for the entire operation. The freezing winter air outside the pick and save felt like needles against Mike's face. He stood by the side of a red fire engine, the bright flashing lights painting the snow-covered parking lot in shifting hues of crimson and blue. His hands were cuffed behind his back. A few yards away, Tony sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a shock blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching his uncle with eyes full of helpless despair. Aunt Brenda was already being escorted to a sleek black government SUV. She didn't look back. She had played her hand perfectly, or so she thought. "Sir, watch your head," the federal agent said, guiding Mike toward the back seat of a squad car. "Wait! Stop!" A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the noise of the idling engines and the shouting firefighters. Susan came sprinting across the icy pavement, clutching a heavy leather briefcase and a manila folder to her chest. Her hair was windswept, her coat covered in ash, but her eyes held the fierce intensity of a top-tier corporate strategist. The agent stopped, his hand on the door. "Ma'am, step back. This is a federal crime scene. I am Susan Vance, legal counsel representing Michael Vance," she lied smoothly, using her maiden name and corporate credentials to project absolute authority. She slammed the manila folder onto the hood of the police car. "Before you put him in that vehicle, you are going to look at this timeline. Because if you arrest him, you are setting the FBI up for a massive wrongful arrest lawsuit." The agent frowned, but Susan's sheer confidence made him hesitate. He opened the folder. "Derek claims Mike was laundering money through this store for the past 6 months, Susan said, her voice cutting through the cold air. "These are the certified corporate auditing logs for Pick and Save, which I pulled from the regional database 20 minutes ago. Every dollar that passed through these registers is accounted for. Furthermore, look at this security footage logs." She pulled out a tablet, displaying a time-stamped video from earlier that afternoon. "This is Martha, the head cashier," Susan pointed to the screen. At 2:14 p.m., she found Mike's master keys and placed them in the lost and found bin. Mike had no access to his own office, the files, or the safe from that moment until the fire broke out. He couldn't have hidden anything, altered any documents, or participated in any transaction. More importantly, Susan flipped to a printed page of text messages. These are cloud backups from Brenda's personal phone, which she synced to the family shared network years ago and forgot about. Look at the timestamps from 3 weeks ago. Brenda was messaging Derek's associates, giving them the layout of the store and explicitly stating that she was going to use her brother's store as a scapegoat to cover her own tracks if the feds got close. The agent read the texts, his jaw tightening. He looked from the paperwork to Brenda, who was just about to get into the SUV. "Hold on," the agent called out to his partner. He walked over to the SUV, showed him the tablet, and pointed toward Brenda. Within seconds, the demeanor of the agents changed. Brenda's expression of smug victory shattered into pure panic as they opened her door, pulled her out, and began reading her rights. Her immunity deal was based on full honesty. She had lied about Mike's involvement. The agent walked back to Mike, pulling out a key, and unlocked the handcuffs. "You're free to go, Mr. Vance. But don't leave the city. We're going to need a full statement tomorrow." Mike rubbed his wrists, looking at Susan. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him completely exhausted. "You saved me," he whispered. "You said you didn't want to be part of this." Susan offered a small, bittersweet smile. She reached out, gently wiping a smudge of soot from his cheek. "I don't want the life that comes with this chaos, Mike. I still don't want to be a parent, but I love you, and I couldn't watch an innocent man, a good man, go down for something he didn't do." She stepped back, her boundaries firm, but her heart clear. "Take care of your nephew, Mike. He needs you. And maybe, when the dust settles, we can figure out what's left of us." She turned and walked back to her car, a strong, independent woman leaving on her own terms. Mike watched her go, a deep sense of gratitude washing over him. Across the parking lot, Mrs. Gable stood behind the police yellow tape, her clipboard lowered, her face pale with embarrassment as she watched the actual criminals being driven away in handcuffs. She caught Mike's eye and quickly looked away, her reign of neighborhood terror thoroughly broken. Mike walked over to the ambulance where Tony was sitting. The boy looked up, his shoulders tense, expecting another lecture, another outburst of anger. Instead, Mike sat down on the bumper next to him. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached out and put his arm around Tony's shoulders, pulling the boy into a firm, protective embrace. Tony stiffened for a fraction of a second, before completely collapsing into the hug, burying his face in his uncle's jacket as his shoulders shook with quiet, cathartic tears. "I've got you, Tony," Mike whispered into the freezing Milwaukee wind. "The store can be rebuilt. The neighborhood can think whatever it wants. But we're going to get through this, together." As the fire trucks began to pack up their hoses, casting long, fading shadows across the snow, the weight of the aisles was finally gone. They didn't have a perfect life, and they didn't have all the answers. But as they looked out over the glowing Milwaukee skyline, they knew one thing for certain. They were finally a family.